Australian Aboriginal Zionism. So for somebody who's never heard of or even conceived of that before, or doesn't understand what that means just from the title of it, can you kind of explain that concept to people?
Yeah, sure. So, kind of rewinding the context here is pretty important. So, last year in 2023, Australia held a referendum whether to implement the Voice, which is a kind of Indigenous Australian committee of advice to the parliament, basically, and that lost by a landslide. And I was, I was against it, just to kind of, all cards open. I was against it pretty vocally and pretty early, and pretty strongly against it. And I'm obviously pleased with the result. But I guess that article that I posted was really a culmination of a bunch of thoughts I had on the issue. The kind of title, Zionism for Aboriginal Australians, was kind of deliberately provocative and tongue in cheek. Like, that's obviously, I don't think anyone has ever used those words in the same sentence. So it's not a pre-existing thing that, so don't feel like you've just not kind of heard of it, because I kind of, deliberately kind of tongue in cheek used a provocative title, but it does belie, some serious sentiments. And if you read it, it's relatively, hopefully it's kind of thoughtful. It's not a piss take. So really, the fundamental question I was kind of exploring in that piece is, why this structure for Indigenous Australian sovereignty, basically, because it seemed a particularly weak form of sovereignty. Why have a committee, with some advice to Parliament? Why kind of attach yourself to this kind of national parliamentary body? Because you can imagine other forms this could have taken. For example, some Australians, so some Indigenous Australians want a treaty. You could imagine wanting the whole of Australia in a really extreme case, which there are probably few real proponents of. But kind of more realistically, like, one very plausible alternative would be to have a sovereign piece of land, a sovereign state within or attached to the physical kind of continent of Australia. It's a massive country. It's totally conceivable that you could kind of take a tiny slice off. Something like 50 Israels or something would fit into New South Wales alone. Like, it's and so Israel's my lens here. Hence Zionism. Zionism is obviously the name for Israeli nationalism, basically. And I'm a Zionist. I'm a Jew. So I'm not actually allergic to the idea of Indigenous aspirations for sovereignty, because I think it's a totally legitimate aspiration for any peoples. And so if you kind of start from that premise that to take aspirations for sovereignty for Indigenous Australians seriously, which I'm more than happy to do because I'm not hypocritical in that way, then the Voice struck me as a very, very strange body. And I won't bore you with the whole argument. It's like 5,000 words of kind of political and historical context within, for Australia. Readers, or listeners might be really surprised that something like 55% of Australia's landmass has some kind of native Indigenous land rights attached to it, which, I think almost no Australians know about and would probably otherwise be rioting in the streets over. But I guess the crux, my kind of between the lines answer to the question why Indigenous Australians aren't asking for their own sovereign state is because they're very pessimistic about its prospects, which is not surprising because if you look at any place within this country, big or small, anywhere at all, any basically any institution, any land, any state, any city, any local council area that is run by Indigenous Australians, it's basically a failure, and it's really grim. And whenever it kind of bubbles up to the surface, it's kind of awkwardly, shied away from by the broader population because it's a difficult thing to stare into. And I obviously say that with no pleasure. It's obviously causes a great deal of suffering. Indigenous Australians have some of the highest incarceration rates in the world because they have some of the highest levels of criminal activity in the world. And kind of all these kind of horrendous child abuse stories and violence and domestic violence and all these kinds of horrible things. So and that kind of irreducibility of that issue kind of has led to a whole bunch of national political derangements. The Australian government kind of funnels, at every level, basically, infinite amount of money at the problem and has forever, and the problem that hasn't really gone away. And so it kind of bubbles up periodically into some grand symbolic gesture, like this great apology in 2007. And then this kind of voice referendum last year for this kind of, addendum to the parliament. But, in some respect, that's deeply pessimistic because the kind of the focus for activists always seems to culminate in this symbolic gesture rather than any meaningful change. And obviously, I would have thought the grandest meaningful change, the kind of greatest independence and standing on your own 2 feet aspirations for people would be their own state. And I think the political aspiration, the political possibility would be great there. This hasn't really been seriously posited to my knowledge, but you can imagine if Indigenous Australians in Australia, actually asked for their own sliver of land somewhere, that could and probably would be facilitated. But that's not even asked for. And I guess the kind of punchline of my piece is that the fact that that's not being even asked for in its strongest form is deeply pessimistic about activists' own assessment of what they can do and the kind of nature and state of that. They'd rather have zero accountability, zero responsibility, and just continue to be dependent on this otherwise really great and fantastic and one of the greatest societies in world history, really, which is the Australian polity. That's my really long answer.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things I want to pick up and maybe bring some really big ideas about ethno-nationalism into this. You have a line that says, there is no cosmic reason for Jews to have a homeland, but not Kurds, Albanians, but not Basque, Armenians, but not Circassians. And that, I mean, I guess so. Like, maybe I'm gonna just play like the devil's advocate here and say that um, when you say later, they can have their own nation. All they need to do is will it. Well, that question of will strikes me as something divine. Like, why do some people why at that particular point in history did Zionism arise and not 100 years earlier, 200, why did those particular events happen in that way? So there is something kind of mysterious. So we can try to be scientific about it. We can try to reduce different cultures and say, well, because of this mechanistic reason, action reaction, kind of modeling it like a physics equation or a chemistry equation. Here are the inputs, here are the outputs. And so, on that basis, whether it's the divinity of like the mysterious creator or whether it's kind of a deistic view or a Spinoza view that God expresses himself or God's self in like pure natural law and pure physical law. You know, either way you look at it, I think that there are key distinctions to be made. And I kind of get into this scuffle with the far right and